Welcome, everybody, to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM, the sportsbook born in Vegas. This is your waiver wire edition of Fantasy Football Today. Today on the show, can Kamani Vidal or Hassan Haskins get you through the next 4 weeks or so? Can Kendrick Bourne have another big performance? Can Bryce Young do well against the Cowboys? Hypothetically, could Dave Richard and Jamey Eisenberg do well against the Cowboys? We're going to answer most of these questions. But first, I've been told that we should do some Who Has More. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for America's 35th favorite fantasy football-related game show, Who Has More? Here we go. Who has more carries in their career, Kamani Vidal or Hassan Haskins?
I'll say Haskins.
I'll say Vidal.
Jamey, congratulations. Come on down. What has he won? He has won the opportunity to tell us his top 3 waiver wire priorities, because Hassan Haskins does have more career carries. They haven't been very effective. But when we look at the waiver wire today, who should we be prioritizing?
I hope you were not going to say I won Hassan Haskins from my fantasy leagues. I'm going to take Kendrick Bourne first, with the hope for him and for fantasy managers who need him that Ricky Pearsall and Juwan Jennings sit out one more week, because without them last week, Kendrick Bourne was an absolute superstar against the Rams. Has a great matchup this week against the Bucs. Mason Taylor has been very good from a target perspective for the last 3 weeks. He's been very good from a fantasy perspective the last 2 weeks. And I think based on how this matchup will go against Denver, where we may see a problem or at least a little bit of a difficult matchup for Garrett Wilson, Mason Taylor gets a lot of targets once again from Justin Fields. But long-term, he could be a must-start tight end rest of season. And then I'm going to still take Kenneth Gainwell as number 1 running back for this week. We don't know how the split will work. It is expected at this point that Jalen Warren will play in Week 6. But we don't know, based on what Gainwell did in Week 4 prior to their bye for the Steelers, when he had the best running back performance for the Steelers, maybe in the last couple of years, but certainly what he did this season against the Vikings. Will he get a little bit more of an opportunity? I would personally like to avoid the Chargers mess. I think by the time we get to the end of the week, you're going to wish you did not spend your fab on either Vidal or Haskins if the Chargers add somebody else this week. So just be cautious with how much money you spend on the Chargers backfield.
And you don't want to use a number 1 waiver claim knowing that you're going to go to the bottom of your waiver list if you spend it on Vidal or Haskins. But there's going to be somebody in every league that goes after these guys. I think Vidal will have a chance if they don't add another running back. And in the next 24, 48 hours, we might learn that they're going to sign somebody off of a practice squad, sign a free agent. Gus Edwards was on their team last year. It's a mess. So you're going to see Kamani Vidal be one of my top 3. But it's with the exact same warning that Jamey just gave you. It could get ugly with that backfield in LA. And by the way, the offensive line for the Chargers looks pretty terrible. Just an awesome matchup this week. I like what you said, Jamey, about Mason Taylor as someone who can help fantasy managers now and long term. That's why he's the number 1 guy that I would get off the waiver wire this week. Even if I needed a running back, even if I needed a wide receiver, he's somebody that I think has rest of season staying power as a tight end, as a flex. It's in PPR only, but I think Mason Taylor's here to stay. 19 targets in his last 2 games. And then Kendre Miller has been coming on for the Saints. There's always the chance that New Orleans moves on from some of their veteran players. That would include Alvin Kamara. That means that Kendre Miller for now is more of a bye-week replacement running back. But by the time we get to Week 10 and that trade deadline's gone, he could be the lead running back for the New Orleans Saints, could be getting 15-plus carries per game, maybe works near the goal line a little bit more. And he's been efficient when he's run the ball this year. So he's probably 2nd or 3rd on my list. Taylor 1. Let's cautiously put Vidal 2nd and then Miller 3rd.
Yeah, and I wasn't even listening, because after that embarrassing Who Has More performance, I just don't even know that we can take you seriously today, Dave. But we'll try. We will try. Now, listen, we're going to start with the running back priorities today, because people just lost Omarion Hampton, obviously, and we need replacements. And if you're not going to go with one of the Chargers guys, maybe there's someone else we can go with. But there is someone that is not quite at the threshold that Jamey uses when he writes the waiver wire column, 65% rostered or less in CBS Sports leagues, and that's Michael Carter. He's 66% rostered, so he's just barely above that. And then on CBS leagues, it's very hard to get Rico Dowdle. But on Yahoo, on ESPN, on Sleeper, Rico Dowdle's available in about 40% of leagues on Yahoo and ESPN, 30% of leagues on Sleeper. So Dowdle and Carter, Jamey, before we get into Gainwell and the rest of the guys that you might have to take a shot on if you're just desperate, these are better than desperation plays. How do you feel about Rico Dowdle and Michael Carter?
Dowdle's a must-start running back as long as Chuba Hubbard's out. We still have to, make sure that Hubbard is going to miss this week's game. But obviously, when you look at what Dowdle just accomplished, 200 yards rushing against the Dolphins, then gets the Cowboys, which is a revenge game. Big opportunity for him to follow it up with another strong game. So would be a must-start running back as long as he is the featured guy there for Carolina. And in the case of Michael Carter, I think they told us what they think of their backfield without Trey Benson there. It's going to be the Michael Carter show, especially after Amari DiMercato had the unfortunate fumble. I can't imagine that Jonathan Gannon is going to go from a game where he only had 3 total touches to say, okay, now you deserve more. It was a great run. It was blocked open very well. It was just, a big hole for him to run through. It's just unfortunate he didn't complete the play. And then I think everybody would be looking at it and say, okay, maybe there is more of a split. But Carter coming off a 5-catch game, I don't think you're going to love the efficiency from him anytime he's on the field. But the touches should be there for him. The Colts defense, not exactly one to run away from, especially in a week with 2 teams on a bye and some of the injuries that we're dealing with the running back position. So Dowdle would be 1 by a mile, Carter second, and then separate those guys from the rest of the field, because whether it's Gainwell, the Chargers backfield, Kendre Miller, any other running backs we're going to talk about, those 2 guys are on a different playing field than the rest of the group.
And a quick point, there is some potential for Chuba Hubbard to be relegated to the 1B running back in Carolina, and Dowdle is the main running back the rest of the season. We saw the Panthers do it last year when they had Chuba Hubbard. They realized, hey, this is our better running back. Let's just roll with him. They could do the exact same thing if Rico Dowdle continues to run well over the next week, 2 weeks, and then whenever Chuba Hubbard comes back. And maybe there's a chance there for Carter, too. I know that they definitely like Trey Benson, but they could end up using both those guys in tandem. So these are 2 running backs that, for now, good starters for fantasy, but maybe even 3, 4, 5 weeks from now, we're still using them as low-end number 2 running backs or high-end flexes.
Yeah, and I actually, in one of my leagues, someone just traded for Trey Benson. In one of my other leagues, someone's been offering me kind of junk for Omari and Hampton. So I think fantasy managers right now, if you're in a position of strength, if you're 3-2, 4-1, especially if you're 5-0, you can see how good of a situation the Cardinals running back, being the starting running back for the Cardinals is. So Trey Benson's a really good guy to try to trade for right now. Just stash him in an IR spot, find that desperate manager, find the desperate Omari and Hampton manager, and see if you can make a good buy low offer. It could benefit both teams for sure. If we throw that list back up again, Dave, and take us through some of the names on there that you might be interested in, if there are any. You talked about Kendre Miller. Tyrone Tracy Jr. has a chance to play this week on Thursday. Tajay Spears. There is Gainwell as well. Some handcuffs here. Anything you'd be looking to go after?
There's 2 names I want to point toward. Number 1 is Tajay Spears. We heard the offensive coordinator for the Titans say today that they intend to get him a little bit more work as they move along. So they're ramping up Tajay Spears as someone that could be the 1B running back to Tony Pollard. And we saw that last year. And there were some games last year where Tajay Spears was good enough to start, 10 PPR points, kind of the same thing that we talked about with other running backs, a bye week replacement, maybe a low-end flex, something like that. So there's room for Tajay Spears on a bench. And I think in deeper leagues, there's room on the bench for Isaiah Davis. We know for the next 7 to 11 weeks, he's going to be the handcuff to Breece Hall. Hall looks great. And that offensive line for the Jets looks good. But if anything were to happen to him, or if he somehow gets traded, then Isaiah Davis would be at the front of the line for the Jets. That's somebody that I wouldn't mind stashing.
Okay. So that's unfortunately not the best running back waiver wire, especially when a running back goes down. We are hoping for a more obvious replacement. But I guess my final question is, Jamey, what makes you think? Because I remember, we did a bonus podcast. It was me, Dave, and Heath, and we just didn't have a lot of enthusiasm for Michael Carter, understandably. Then he goes out and he has almost all the touches and he scores a touchdown. Why are we not there with the Chargers? Why can't one of these guys be, I wouldn't say can't, but why are we not expecting one of these guys to be the next Michael Carter?
I mean, one of them can. It's just a matter of who is it going to be. In the case of the Cardinals, you could at least say, okay, Carter had opportunities end of the 2024 season where the Cardinals leaned on him as a featured guy. And DiMercato, 3 times in the 2023 season, got a chance to be double-digit carries and did nothing with it. These 2 guys are such unknowns from what I think the Chargers even look at it. And for Vidal, I go back to it. He's the one I would want if I have to get one of the 2 guys. But I go back to last year. J.K. Dobbins missed 4 seasons. Gus Edwards was doing nothing. And they still kept trudging him out there to do nothing. So they clearly don't trust him to some capacity. He's been on the practice squad for a reason. Clearly, they signed Najee Harris. They drafted Marion Hampton. They were looking to upgrade their backfield. But they don't have a lot of trust in Vidal for whatever reason. Maybe this is just the opportunity he needs to prove himself, and I hope he does. I think we go back to last year. A lot of people, myself included, were saying, look at the opportunity. This was before they signed Dobbins and signed Edwards. It was like this could be the guy that the Chargers were looking at, and he was a big flop. So if they weren't playing the Dolphins in Week 6, it would be a complete no-no. The offensive line is a disaster. They're struggling right now across the board with injuries. And so hopefully one of these guys does something against Miami and you say, okay, now I have the Carter situation. Carter did what he did last week, and now you can feel comfortable with him. I hope that's the case. But it could be Haskins. It could be Vidal. Go back and listen to our podcast. I think you made a great point. Would you rather spend $10 on Vidal or $2 on Haskins? You might just be better off spending the $2 on Haskins because he may be the guy. He had more carries last week anyway. It just may be a situation where that's the guy that Harbaugh trusts.
Okay. Well, we'll see if we trust any quarterbacks on the waiver wire. We'll be back after this and talk about some of the quarterbacks that you could stream for Fantasy Week 6.
Whoa!
Well, we don't usually get breaking news right before the segment that is so relevant for the breaking news, but the Cleveland Browns and the Cincinnati Bengals are making a trade, and Joe Flacco is going to the Bengals. They needed a quarterback upgrade. Hopefully they're getting it. Cleveland certainly did not get a quarterback upgrade with Joe Flacco. He was really bad. He averaged 5.1 yards per attempt with the Browns. A couple years ago with the Browns, he averaged 7.9 yards per attempt. So hopefully he's still got something left in the tank as we welcome you back to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM. And this is huge news, more so for Chase and Higgins. So, Jamey, take it away. Your analysis of this trade, according to Ian Rappaport and Tom Pelissero, the Bengals trading for Joe Flacco.
I mean, look, they got another version of Jake Browning, but maybe it's a more competent version of Jake Browning. He's not going to be mobile. He's going to still have to deal with that bad offensive line that Browning was dealing with. But give the Bengals credit for at least trying. Now, we would have preferred, let's say, a Jameis Winston or somebody that could, I think, take the receiving core to another level. But like you said, we've seen Flacco in his history do this. We just got to get him now to play for the Steelers at some point, and he gets the whole AFC North locked up. But at this point, look, give the Bengals some credit for trying. It hasn't been working with Browning. The interceptions have been an issue. At least when you saw last week for Chase in particular, I know Higgins had the touchdown. When the matchup is not so overwhelming, where the quarterback play is going to be such a deficit, they still have the ability to produce at a high level. And so the 2 weeks prior, where they struggled with the defenses that they faced, then they play the Lions with that bad secondary. This is going to be a tough matchup still against the Green Bay Packers. You expect at least, he's coming in with the ability to get the game plan in, showing up on Tuesday, so they could do all their installs for Flacco on Wednesday, and he's most likely starting against the Packers. But I just give them credit for trying. They're trying to salvage their season 2-3 after a 2-0 start, lose 3 straight games after losing Joe Burrow. They just got to try and stay close to 500 until Burrow is able to come back, and maybe they can make a playoff push. But for the receivers, for fantasy, this is me a slight upgrade. I'm definitely starting Jamar Chase. I was starting him anyway. He was a top 10 wide receiver for this week. Higgins gets closer now to the top 24. You need to see it. But I do think that if we are talking about one thing in particular, the downfield throws will be there for Higgins. That's something that Jake Browning has not been doing, and I think Higgins will benefit the most from this.
And we saw that with Flacco in Cleveland. His attempt rate on passes of 15-plus air yards was 21.3%. That's higher than what Jake Browning was at. I also want to tell you that Flacco had a better catchable throw rate than Jake Browning. And he also had 11 drops by his receivers in Cleveland. That's pretty much why his completion rate was lower than Jake Browning. So he's going to take more chances downfield. That's great for both wide receivers. And the Bengals are going to have to continue to throw. Their defense is, if it gets better at all, it'll only be nominally better. They're really not in a position for that defense to be great, so you know what the game script is going to be every week. And you also know that Joe Flacco doesn't consistently throw to his running backs out of the backfield. I know in week 1 for Cleveland, he threw a ton to those running backs. Not sure he's going to do it that much, so that might hurt Chase Brown just a little bit. I think it's like you said, Jamey, it's a slight upgrade for Chase and Higgins, and it gives them somebody that will be willing to throw a little bit further downfield and isn't as bad as the stats made him look when he was in Cleveland.
I hope so. He throws a lot. I mean, he very often throws 40 or more pass attempts. So I don't see why that wouldn't necessarily continue. That's kind of how the Bengals run their offense. They like to throw the ball as well. So we're in a super flex league together. I don't have that much money left, so I put in a bid for Joe Flacco, who I originally drafted and then dropped, and now I'm trying to get him back. It is what it is. But I guess from that perspective, I can't imagine people are going to pick him up in a 1 QB league, but maybe he's got Jason Higgins. How much of your fab would you spend based on your original budget in a Superflex league for Joe Flacco?
If they're committing to him for the rest of the season, you got to go north of 15%. I mean, we're talking about, again, this is scarce quarterback production. And so many people, I know I did in one Superflex league, spent a lot of their fab on Jake Browning, with the idea of this receiving core, this offense is going to build that quarterback up to the level of 18-plus points per game on a consistent basis. That's what Browning was doing in 2023 when he was a starter for those 7 games. That's obviously what Joe Burrow does. I mean, we just haven't seen it for the majority of this tenure. Week 2, when he stepped in, he had great fantasy production. Week 5, he had great fantasy production. You know what you're getting. I think Flacco's going to be a similar type of player. So that 2023 season when Flacco came back, I know it feels like it's forever ago, and he's now gone from 38 years old to 40, so he's not getting any better. But he was consistently 300 yards in the last 5 games, 5 of the last 6 games. He was over 20 fantasy points in that stretch as well. So he still has that ability. And I do think to compare the Cleveland situation and the Cincinnati situation, not exactly fair because this receiving core just is so much better. So, yes, he did struggle with the Browns to start the season. Yes, he's older and probably washed up. But hopefully the Bengals are making the move that this guy is still going to have something left to really just elevate that offense as a whole.
Yeah, those receivers will absolutely help his numbers. And it's kind of funny. He's playing the Packers for the second time this year. Remember, he took them on already earlier this year with Cleveland. And who won that game, by the way?
He won.
He won that game. So his numbers weren't great. It stung for fantasy. But he's got some experience against this opponent. So I don't know if we're ready to just say Cincinnati's going to fold up shop and not get any points this week against the Packers. Tough matchup, but Flacco has some experience against them already.
Yeah, I just want to we know that they made the trade. We don't know who the starter is for this week. They might think it's too soon. They might be just getting depth and putting Jake Browning on notice, saying, you got one more chance. Well, probably, but just we don't know that yet. They haven't announced it. So to make a trade on a Tuesday and have them start on a Sunday might be kind of difficult, although the fact that he already faced them does help.
I mean, this is a guy that came off this couch and started for the Browns once upon a time. Like, he's going to be fine.
Right, and he's been in a version of this offense multiple times in his career.
Okay. Well, how about the other quarterbacks? He's not the only one out there that we could pick up. Let's take a look at Jamey's top priorities on the waiver wire at the quarterback position this week with only 2 teams on bye. Hopefully you don't need to go to the waiver wire, but if you do, Sam Darnold was great last week. Sam Darnold could be good against the Jaguars. This week he's 50% rostered. Tua showed that he could still put up points even without Tyreek Hill. Mac Jones has been really good, and the 49ers, surprisingly, they are one of the most pass-heavy teams in football. It is awesome. There's your top 3. And then you got Bryce Young with the dream matchup against the Cowboys. How do you see this group of waiver wire quarterbacks?
It's more desperation plays. None of these guys are in my top 12, but I think you got to give Darnold some credit. He's been 18 or more points in 4 straight games. Like you said, the big game that we saw against Tampa Bay, he threw the ball more, a season-high 34 pass attempts. So we'd love to see him get to that mid-30s on a consistent basis. Just hasn't been the norm for this offense. Maybe that happens against Jacksonville. I think in the case of Tua, matchup is not necessarily something you run away from. And ironically enough, first game without Tyreek Hill, he has his best fantasy outing of the season. You mentioned Mac Jones. He's made 3 starts now for the 49ers. 2 of them, he's been great fantasy-wise. Last week was the most impressive for me because so beat up he was. With the receiving core obviously missing key guys without Ricky Pearsall and Juwan Jennings there. Great matchup this week against Jacksonville. The one that's interesting is Bryce Young because the matchup, we've talked about this a lot, Adam. This 3-game stretch that he's in the middle of now. The Dolphins game, gets the Cowboys this week, gets the Jets next week. We would love any quarterback in this scenario. He's had 1 game over 20 fantasy points. Just had only 15 fantasy points against Miami. Can you really trust him against the Cowboys? I think he's a great DFS play. He's a great plug and play if you're missing a guy in the super flex or 2 quarterback league. He's been on your bench. But in a 1 quarterback league, I just can't trust him, even though the matchup is as perfect as you could possibly find.
I feel the exact same way, too. I like Darnold as the top 12 quarterback, but it's toward the bottom of that list, a low-end QB1. We've seen him get around 20 fantasy points each of his last 3 games. And I think the matchup against Jacksonville, the Jaguars coming off of an emotional win on Monday night, They could be ripe for the picking, and I could see Seattle having a good game throwing the ball against them, and that's Darnold to a T. And I agree with you on Mac Jones, Jamie. I really love what I've seen from him 2 or 3 weeks, taking on Tampa. Tampa's really good against the run. They are so beat up in their secondary, and their pass rush is a question mark at this point. I think you can make the case for Mac Jones. If not the second best, but the best quarterback on this list, I would start him over Tua Tagovailoa this week against the Chargers.
Are there any quarterbacks that you typically start that you don't like this week and would be looking at the waiver wire?
Kyler would be the one, just with the matchup against the Colts and the fact that he's struggling a little bit. We don't know how healthy he is with the foot injury. So I don't love the situation for Kyler. He's had some great matchups in the last several weeks, hasn't taken advantage of it. The one hope would be is that Marvin Harrison Jr. going back to the place where his dad, was a Hall of Famer. Do they try to feature him a little bit more? Harrison's been making some great plays lately. Should have had a touchdown last week, which would have helped Kyler's numbers. It feels like Kyler's just been falling short a little bit because of some circumstances and some stupidity by the Cardinals. Go figure there. But in the case of some of these guys that we're talking about here, Darnold should be over Kyler, Tua over Kyler, Mac Jones over Kyler. I think that's easy.
I'll give you another name, Adam. Jared Goff. Last week, he was awesome. He was against Cincinnati. He seems to do well against inferior defenses. He's got Kansas City this week. Tough matchup for Jared Goff. And the matchup is in Kansas City. So now he's on the road again. Doesn't seem like a great spot for him. I'd rather start Darnold, Mac Jones, etc. ahead of Jared Goff.
Justin Fields against the Broncos?
For sure, must-start type of fantasy quarterback. The rushing upside is too good.
Okay, so you're not starting Darnold, etc. over Justin Fields?
I'm not.
No.
Okay. Well, we got a lot more to talk about here on Fantasy Football today. Really exciting to have this breaking news. Good stuff. Joe Flacco to the Bengals, and you can maybe breathe a sigh of relief if you were nervous about Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Maybe. Things should get better. But when we come back, get your Born Identity team names ready, because we are talking about waiver wire wide receivers after this on Fantasy Football Today. Do you need a wide receiver this week? Yes, of course you need a wide receiver. You're playing fantasy football. And wide receiver is tough, especially in those 3 wide receiver leagues. Well, you're back. We've got some help for you on the waiver wire. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM. Okay, Jamie and Dave, let's take a look at the waiver wire list. Kendrick Bourne is coming off the best game of his career, more than 140 yards. His previous career high was 100 yards. He's got some history with Mac Jones. They were on the Patriots together, and it's working. The connection worked last week, so maybe it can work again. Of course, we don't know the status of Ricky Pearsall and Jawan Jennings, but we're hopeful for another big game from Kendrick Bourne. So, Jamie, he is your number one waiver wire priority. How would you compare him to, I think, Darius Slayton? Was Slayton the number one guy last week? He was certainly up there. How would you compare Bourne to week 5 Slayton?
It's been the same type of guy, Adam, almost the entire season when we're looking at these waiver wire priorities at this position. There's been nobody that has stepped up and had sustained production over the course of several weeks. Remember, Troy Franklin was a guy. Trey Tucker was a guy. Darius Slayton, you mentioned, was one of these guys. Kendrick Bourne now steps into this role. The point would be is don't overspend from a fab perspective. Wide receiver has been decimated due to injuries and poor production from a lot of guys at the top. So you're scrambling to try and find answers, like you said, in 3 receiver leagues. This guy has a chance to play well. Matchup is great. Previous week is great. Situation could be great if 2 things happen. One, does Mac Jones remain the starter? Not that Brock Purdy would not lean on Kendrick Bourne if the other 2 receivers aren't there, but you mentioned it, their history together from New England. The bigger question, though, is do Ricky Pearsall and or Jawan Jennings return? I don't know what would happen if one of them is back, if that still means Bourne's in such a prominent situation. But clearly, if both are out, you saw the targets, you saw the production, you saw them come back to him after the previous week. In week 4, he had a terrible drop from Brock Purdy. And so hopefully Mac Jones to Kendrick Bourne continues for at least one more week if you are looking at a desperation play, because I think that's really what it is, because we just don't know what the scenario will be. You got to spend your fab dollars on Tuesday night or your waiver priority on Tuesday night. Wednesday might be a little bit different once we get a practice report. I will disagree with you on one thing. You might not have a wide receiver to play this week that you should be picking up, and that's Jalen Coker, because there's a chance that he could be a big-time playmaker for the Carolina Panthers. We saw at the end of last season. We know what this team looks like right now. It's Teteroa, McMillan, and a bunch of other guys trying to fill spots. Xavier Legette, Hunter Renfrow. These guys have had some moments, but I think that Coker comes back from this absence with a quad injury and could be a go-to guy for Bryce Young right away. So after Bourne, Coker's the next guy I would go get. Everybody else on this list is going to be a guy that you might pick up and maybe get a week or two out of, but you're probably going to drop them. That's why their roster percentages are where they are. That's why their production has been where they are. Guys like Rashid Shaheed, he's got now 2 touchdowns and then 3 games where he's done nothing. Darnell Mooney's done nothing so far this season. We're hoping that he bounces back to next week. So for me, I'm looking at it at a 1-week scenario in the case of Bourne and a long-term play in Jalen Coker with the hope that he comes back and does something of significance.
And it's definitely an ugly list. And the only thing that I would add is double check to see if there isn't a better Packers wide receiver on your waiver wire. Romeo Doubs went into the bye with a 3-touchdown game and looks to be a regular part of that Packers passing game. And Matthew Golden's a receiver that we were excited about during training camp in the preseason. He started to put some things together over his past couple of games. I wonder if he could end up being just fine as a player that you put on your bench and then you wait a little bit. You take the patient route with him, and he ends up becoming maybe the best receiver or second best receiver in Green Bay. I know it's been a long time since we've been able to trust a Packers wide receiver, but those two guys, if they're out there in your Yahoo leagues, ESPN leagues, sleeper leagues, they're already rostered in too many CBS leagues. But if they're out there in those other formats, and go and get them. They've got more upside, certainly long-term, compared to pretty much every other wide receiver on this list.
And Calvin Ridley as well, another guy that's in the similar range, coming off a strong game, finally connecting with Cam Ward. So make sure Calvin Ridley's not available on your waiver wire. Go get him if he is.
Yeah, I mean, look, these guys are available in 70 to 75% of leagues, basically, around there. So it's certainly possible that one of them slips through the cracks and is available, especially those guys who could have been dropped going into their bye. I struggle with Golden. I don't know how patient I can be. Is now Christian Watson will be back within the next 3 weeks, unless they put him on season-ending IR. I don't see why that would happen. And Jaden Reed will probably be back, close to the same timeline. So Dobbs feels like the guy that I could start now and, hope to get a touchdown. If not, I'll probably get something like a Rashid Shaheed performance. But Golden, I don't know. I know how talented he is. When does he's basically Travion Henderson and RJ Harvey right now. We're just holding out for hope, aren't we?
You are definitely holding out for hope, but you saw some flashes the last 2 weeks, the 2 games that they played without Jaden Reed on the field. You mentioned that, but look, what does Watson look like when he comes back? Is he just going to have a handful of plays, to stretch the defense and maybe take a few shots down the field? They want to get Matthew Golden involved. They didn't spend the draft capital on him to just be a part-time player. And so the ramp-up period is coming, and hopefully coming off the bye, this is now the time where he really jumps off and can be a significant playmaker for this team. So he's definitely worth putting on your bench. That said, Adam, obviously we're dealing with a lot of situations where guys not on IR, or if you don't have IR spots in your league, you're going to prioritize holding on to a Amari Hampton more so than a Matthew Golden. Some of these injuries. Mike Evans, for example, you're going to certainly roster him over a Matthew Golden. So I think in the case of this week in particular, when the matchup is so good, coming off of a bye week, if he doesn't do anything that's going to give you the signs of hope that you've been waiting for, the type of production you've been looking for, then you probably have to move on from him in certain situations. But if you have enough roster space to carry a guy like this, we know what rookie wide receivers tend to do at the end of the season, and this could easily be one of those guys. Christian Watson, Jaden Reed notwithstanding, I think he could be better than this entire group just based on what his potential could be.
Yeah, and we know that bye weeks can change things, especially for rookies. I feel like it's more of a running back thing, but maybe they make it a point during their bye week to get Matthew Golden going a little bit. Dave, I wouldn't mind Trey Tucker or Rashid Shaheed. I mean, I think after that, if you look at the list, Ryan Flournoy obviously could go back to being completely irrelevant. But just those two specifically, Tucker, assuming Bowers is out, and Shaheed, who I at least feel confident is going to get 5-6 targets and has big play potential, I wouldn't mind starting them as a wide receiver 3.
I mean, I'd rather start Kendrick Bourne. So if I had my choice between Bourne, who's available in over 90% of leagues, or one of those two, I'd rather have Bourne. But I get it with Shaheed. He's had at least 8 PPR points in every game this year, and that's not a great number. But you know what the upside is. There's always the chance that the Saints move on from him, and he gets traded to a better team before this season is over and done with. So he's not bad as someone that you could use as a spot starter over the next week or two. But if you don't like what you're getting out of him, you're going to move on from him pretty quickly. Or if you're not even using him, you might drop him to go after one of these wait-and-see type players that we talked about and will talk about, especially when it comes to tight ends.
Okay. And then you want to give thoughts on Trey Tucker going up against the Titans. They're 8th worst against tight ends. And if Bowers doesn't play, he had 6 targets last week, but he's also had 2 games this year with 8 or 9 targets, and he's a big play threat.
He is a big play threat. He's also used in short and intermediate routes, had double-digit PPR points last week, I believe. And he's okay. Again, a spot starter. I'd rather have Shaheed if we're thinking long-term, because once Brock Bowers comes back, I don't like the target volume potential for Trey Tucker unless something else happens to this Raiders receiving core. And their passing offense hasn't exactly been great either with Geno Smith under center.
To be fair, his 2 best games target-wise were with Brock Bowers on the field. So he did have the 8 and the 9 target game when Bowers was there, but clearly not the right Brock Bowers. He was coming off the knee injury. Those were the first 2 games for him. So I don't know if the targets necessarily are dictated solely by Bowers being there, not being there. I do think that this Raiders team is going to rely on Trey Tucker because Deontay Thornton just hasn't become that guy yet. I think he's got plenty of potential to do so. That's a team I think you want to look at that could be trading somebody. Jacoby Myers, we know he wants a contract. His production has not been very good right now. They're continuing to struggle. That could be somebody that a team is definitely coveting because of what he's capable of doing. And then maybe somebody to look at is Jack Besh, who can certainly step up and has had a couple catches over the last several weeks. But I think just in the case of some young guys, Adam, not just Golden, if you're looking to stash, Torrey Horton's got 3 touchdowns in his last 4 games. We know if the Seahawks decide to throw the ball a little bit more, maybe he gets a few more targets. And then Isaiah Bond, we know what Cedric Tillman's out for the next 4 games. 4 games
At
is
least.
on IR.
Yeah.
And he's got 13 targets in his last 2 games. Did not do well against Minnesota in week 5, but there's a chance there that Dylan Gabriel can lean on him. We know Judy's not producing at this point. The tight ends have gotten a little bit of production last week. So Bond is somebody, if you're looking to stash a wide receiver, plenty of upside there, as we know.
And I'll just make a quick excuse for Darnell Mooney. He had nearly 1,000 yards in 16 games last year, was a fairly reliable wide receiver 3. He didn't really have a training camp. He got hurt. He didn't have a preseason. So this is a guy that hopefully is working his way back into shape, or form anyway, coming off of an injury. Maybe takes these 2 weeks off and things click for him, because Penix has been very up and down, but sometimes Penix is really good. So maybe Darnell Mooney can rediscover that.
I don't disagree. He just hasn't been good so far. Mooney has with Penix. 1 game, and it was the end of last season. And so this year there's just been a little bit of a disconnect, like you said. Could be because of the lack of prep. But now a shoulder injury that we know is going to sort of linger all season, and a hamstring injury, like this just could feel like a lost year for Darnell Mooney. So I do appreciate you cheating with the rules last year in your Dynasty League where I could not get him. So I do have that fab saved that I could use now.
Yes. See, you're very welcome,
Thank
Jamey.
you.
Also, a little bit of a commissioner. I was going to get mad at Jamey for this on the show, but I totally forgot. So I co-manage a team in the Fantasy Football Today League with Dustin, who generously donated to St. Jude to be part of the league. And we had the Chiefs DST, and we were facing, think about all the things that happened at the end of the game last night. We were facing Travis Kelce, I think Brian Thomas Jr., and we had the Chiefs DST. So we didn't lose, I think, on the Trevor Lawrence touchdown at the end, but we did lose on the Kelce catch at the end. But apparently our commissioner, Jamey, has it set up so that DSTs lose points on a pick 6. So on Mahomes' pick 6, it wasn't against the DST.
It's points against the team.
They weren't even on the field. So I was going to get really mad at you, but then Dustin told me that even if that setting hadn't been applied, we would have lost anyway. So I guess I kind of couldn't. Yeah, but I wanted to, Jamey. I'm looking for excuses to get mad at you. So maybe you'll make up for it with
a little bit.
Yeah, maybe you'll make up for it with some great tight end advice. Because tight end actually looks pretty good on the waiver wire, and we'll talk about that when we come back on Fantasy Football Today. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. Adam Aizer, Dave Richard, Jamey Eisenberg. Guys, how good is tight end? Just don't you feel like most of your teams you're good with your tight end?
It's the year of the tight end.
Yeah, finally, after all these years.
Except for Brock Bowers and Trey McBride, they suck.
McBride doesn't suck. People are being too hard on Trey McBride. Buy low on Trey McBride, I think. But if you don't want to do that, you can just go to the waiver wire. And let's talk about, before we get into the list of guys who are rostered in fewer than 65% of leagues, 2 guys who are 67%, 69% rostered, David Njoku, Kyle Pitts. If they were available, Who do you prefer of those two? Would they be the number one available tight end, Njoku and Pitts?
I would say Pitts would be number one on that list, and I would still rather have Mason Taylor than David Njoku. I don't want to commit too much to David Njoku just because he had one big game with Dylan Gabriel. It was a good game. He looked great. So I'm hoping they can build on that. But I've already seen multiple games from Mason Taylor with Justin Fields, and Kyle Pitts has had a pretty decent start to the season, so I'd want to continue on with that.
I would go Taylor 1, Njoku 2, and Pitts 3. The only concern I have with Pitts is his best games so far this season have come when Darnell Mooney has not been on the field. And so this was kind of the case last year. I hope it's not the case going forward. We know that Michael Penix really loves throwing the ball to Kyle Pitts, and he's been productive this year. But I think the upside from a ceiling perspective favors Taylor, his role in the offense, definitely number 2 in terms of targets. And right now, Njoku, I'm just going to go on the hope that with what we saw from Dylan Gabriel continues.
Okay. What I like about Pitts is the role has changed for Kyle Pitts. He's a great target now, makes him a little bit more reliable with the PPR fantasy points. So I think even with Mooney coming back into form, as I keep saying, it might make Pitts more consistent. Taylor, you love the fact that he has had 2 encouraging games in a row, but they were against Dallas and Miami. However, you look at his schedule, it's really, really good going forward. So let's take a look at Jamey's top waiver wire priorities, players rostered in 65% of leagues or fewer, and Mason Taylor's number 1. And you've got some other options in there. There's Theo Johnson, who's got Thursday night against the Eagles. Not an easy matchup, but Darius Slayton, probably not going to play. I'll call him questionable at this point. And also, I mean, the roster percentages on these guys are so widely available. So it's exciting, Jamey. How many of them would you feel comfortable starting this week?
I definitely would start Mason Taylor. I would start Jake Tongas this week. So if you're just looking from a 1-week situation, I think he's got a great opportunity with George Kittle not going to play, and then at least not expected to play, and then the questionable situation about the 49ers receivers. That would change some things if Pearsall and Jennings are back. But going into the week, we're not expecting those guys to play. I think in the case of Theo Johnson, you've seen it now. 12 targets in 2 starts for Jackson Dart, and now no Darius Slayton if he does not play Thursday night. So if he stays in that 6+ target range, there's an opportunity for him scoring 3 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. So there's a chance for him to continue to be a playmaker. Barner's the tougher one to trust because it's been very touchdown dependent. That said, we saw a spike in pass attempts for Sam Darnold and a spike in targets for Barner, getting 7 against the Bucs. So can he stay in that 5, 6, 7 target range? That's the biggest question. But he's got 4 touchdowns in his last 4 games, so clearly doing a good job finding the end zone. Fannin, another guy benefiting from Dylan Gabriel. Short area target, got in the end zone for the first time this season. So there are a lot of guys. Evan Ingram's got 13 targets in his last 2 games. So these guys are starting to get a little bit more productive, and it's easy to pivot away from T.J. Hockenson on a bye. Mark Andrews, who you're most likely not going to start, taking on the Rams, has a bye next week, so you can move on from those 2 guys who are rostered in north of 80% of leagues. And I think the same thing with Juwan Johnson. Unfortunately, we may have gotten the best out of him. Those first 3 weeks were fantastic. The last 2 weeks have been disappointing. And then you get Taysom Hill and Foster Moreau playing, plus some other guys starting to emerge, and Rashid Shaheed hopefully getting a few more opportunities as well. So I don't know if you want to trust those guys in particular. So 3 guys that have either been drafted to be starters or you've been using them as starters, you can pivot to Taylor or Johnson or maybe even a Jake Tongas for at least 1 week.
And the thing that I like best about Mason Taylor is that he could be a rest of season starter for your fantasy team at tight end or at flex. If it's a PPR league, the way that he's being used in this offense, it's not some magical formula. He's running hitch routes of like 10 yards. He's the check down guy for Justin Fields. When Justin Fields' first read, i.e. Garrett Wilson, is covered, he's throwing to Mason Taylor. And Mason Taylor's catching the ball. Sometimes he gets some yards after. Sometimes he doesn't. He's not explosive, but he's on the field. He's playing. The target volume is huge. I'm a big fan of what we've seen from Mason Taylor, and I think he's not going away from that offense. There's one other name on this list, and this might be the name that I try and stash in every league I can. Colston Loveland with the Chicago Bears. We saw in week 3, 6 snaps he played. He had 3 targets. He had 31 yards on 1 catch, but still 31 yards. It looked like maybe the Bears were trying to get him going at the beginning of that game, and then he got hurt. And now it seems like he's healthy. Looks like he has a chance to play in week 6. Kind of a challenging matchup going up against the Commanders, but you know something? This is somebody that if you can stash, I would stash him ahead of just about every single wide receiver that we talked about long term. Not the guys that are 1-week options. Like, I'd rather have Kendrick Bourne for this week than Colson Loveland if I need a receiver this week and I'm down to one spot. But getting Colson Loveland on the bench and seeing what happens this week is going to be a priority for me if I don't need a tight end. If I've already got a good tight end on my roster, if someone else spends more for Mason Taylor, if someone on waivers gets Taylor first, Loveland's going to be the name that I go after next.
Yeah, and they threw 9 times to Cole Kmet last week, so they definitely want to get.
And he was terrible. He was terrible.
They really want to get the tight end going in the offense for sure. I just want to say one more thing about Juwan Johnson. He played 85% of the snaps. That's still really good. Remember, Spencer Rattler. So 2 weeks ago they played Buffalo. He only threw 27 passes in that game, and Buffalo looks like they're elite against tight ends right now. This week they beat the Giants. They only threw 31 passes. I understand moving on from Juwan Johnson, but I still think, if they keep losing, which I expect them to do, they're going to be throwing more, and he might get back to 7-8 targets, something like that. All right, I'm going to take a break here, and when we come back, I love hearing from our audience, so we're going to find out your ad drop questions. We're going to answer them for you right after this on Fantasy Football Today. Send us those questions, like this one from Mark. Please tell me you're not considering dropping Jaden Daniels, Mark, but he wants to know, as the Daniels manager looking ahead to the bye week, grab Tua, Stroud, Darnold, or Trevor Lawrence.
Well, you certainly don't want to drop Jaden Daniels. That seems pretty silly. And Daniels' bye week is week 12, so I think you're really getting too far ahead of it. I wouldn't worry about this until week 9 or 10 at the absolute earliest.
Mark has a calendar and a spreadsheet, and he's good to go. He wants to know week 12 of 2027 already.
Yeah, and look, you got a lot of options there.
Listen, and Tua can't be the answer because he's on bye that week as well.
All right, Alex. This looks like we have a sad Chargers fan here. You lost to the Giants. Chargers backfield. Are they worth it, and how much fab?
I think you got to take a chance on one of them, just, not necessarily go crazy with it, because clearly if you're missing a running back, need something, it's worth trying to figure out if one of these guys can step forward, especially against Miami. So Vidal would be the preferred choice. I would say maybe 10 to 15% tops. Let somebody else overpay for them.
I think Vidal is the right choice. He's got a little bit more juice and wiggle than Haskins does. Haskins is kind of like LA's DeMercado. But I think he'd actually hold on to the football if he crossed the goal line. And I think only the manager that has Omarion Hampton would spend 15% of fab on either of those running backs. So if you're just trying to stash running backs, you might be able to get one of these guys for 7%.
Next, please. Is DeMercado droppable for Haskins or Brashard Smith?
I take the chance on Haskins just to see what happens.
Yep. You're jumping from one lily pad to the next.
Haskins or Vidal?
Vidal.
I don't think I'm going to change my answer this soon after saying Vidal over Haskins.
Is that our last one? Oh, we have more. I want to upgrade my running backs, Kamara and Swift. My wide receivers are Lamb, Abuka, Drake London, and JSN. Is Achane or Cook a good even swap in PPR?
I don't know if anybody's giving you Achane or Cook for any of those receivers unless Lamb is coming back this week. But if you can turn any of those guys at this point, since you have so much depth, into one of those running backs, I would absolutely do it.
I wouldn't want to trade JSN, and I wouldn't want to trade Lamb. If you can give up one of your running backs and one of those other two wide receivers to get one of Achane or Cook, I would do that. And I would expect Achane would be available cheaper than Cook at this point.
All right, do we have time for one last one? No, we do not. We don't. Sorry. But thank you so much for watching Fantasy Football Today. If you enjoyed the show, please check out the Fantasy Football Today podcast anywhere you listen. If you didn't enjoy the show, well, thanks for watching anyway. Appreciate that. That was nice of you. And thanks so much to Dave Richard and Jamey Eisenberg, to all of you for watching and listening. I am Adam Aizer. We will talk to you next time on Fantasy Football Today.